Ethan Carter was a man who loved to talk. He could go on for hours about anything and everything, but his favorite topic was music. To him, music wasn't just a hobby. It was life itself. He believed that everyone should appreciate it, understand it, and maybe even play an instrument or two. Ethan had strong opinions about almost everything, and when he spoke, people listened. Some thought he was brilliant, while others found him annoying. But no one could deny that Ethan had a way with words. On this particular afternoon, Ethan was sitting in a cozy coffee shop in downtown Chicago. The shop was small but busy, filled with the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the sound of quiet chatter. Outside, the streets were alive with honking cars and hurried footsteps, but inside, it felt calm. Ethan sat at a round wooden table with 3 of his friends, 2 men and a woman, all of whom were used to his endless debates. They had learned to nod along politely when Ethan started one of his rants, which happened often. Today's conversation had begun innocently enough. Someone mentioned a recent concert they'd attended, and Ethan immediately launched into a discussion about how modern musicians didn't have the same depth as the great composers of the past. These days, he said, shaking his head dramatically, people think strumming a guitar and mumbling nonsense is art. Real music takes skill, emotion, and years of practice. His friends nodded, though they weren't paying much attention. They knew better than to argue with Ethan when he was in one of his moods. Across the table, however, sat Karoline Leavitt, someone who rarely joined their group. She was new to the circle, having met Ethan through mutual acquaintances. Unlike Ethan, Karoline was quiet and thoughtful. She worked as a political strategist, a job that required patience and careful planning. While Ethan thrived in chaos, Karoline preferred order. Karoline had been listening to Ethan's speech about music with mild interest. When he paused to take a sip of his coffee, she leaned forward slightly and asked, "Do you really think everyone should care about music as much as you do?" Her question caught Ethan off guard. He set his cup down and raised an eyebrow. "Of course I do," he replied confidently. "Music is universal. It speaks to something deep inside us, something primal. If you don't get that, then maybe you're missing out on what makes us human." Karoline smiled faintly. "I'm not saying I don't appreciate music. I just don't think it's the only thing that defines humanity. There are other forms of expression, you know." This sparked another round of debate. Ethan argued passionately, using examples from history and philosophy to support his point. Meanwhile, Karoline countered calmly, pointing out that not everyone connected with music in the same way. The rest of the group watched silently, amused by the exchange. It wasn't often that someone challenged Ethan so directly. As the argument continued, Ethan grew more animated. Finally, in a moment of playful arrogance, he turned to Karoline and said, "You know, all this talk is fine, but actions speak louder than words. Why don't you prove you're not completely tone deaf? Go ahead. Play something on that old piano over there." He gestured toward the corner of the cafe where an upright piano stood. It was dusty and slightly out of tune, but it was still playable. The challenge was meant as a joke, a way to lighten the mood. Ethan expected Karoline to laugh it off or admit defeat. Instead, she surprised everyone by standing up without hesitation. "I'll give it a try," she said simply, her voice steady. For a moment, no one moved. Even Ethan seemed taken aback by her willingness to accept the dare. Then shrugging as if to say, "Don't blame me if this goes badly," he gestured for her to proceed. Karoline walked over to the piano and sat down on the bench. She adjusted her position slightly, resting her hands on the keys. The room grew quieter as people noticed what was happening. Conversations trailed off and heads turned toward the piano. Ethan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, wearing a smug grin. He was sure this would end in embarrassment for Karoline, or at least provide some light entertainment. But then, something unexpected happened. Karoline began to play. At first, the notes were soft and hesitant, as if she were testing the instrument. But within seconds, her confidence grew. Her fingers danced across the keys with surprising speed and precision. The melody that filled the room was hauntingly beautiful, a piece that many recognized as Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. Each note rang out clearly, despite the piano's age and imperfections. Ethan's grin faded. His eyes widened as he realized that Karoline wasn't just fumbling around, she was playing with skill and emotion. The music flowed effortlessly from her fingertips, capturing the attention of everyone in the cafe. People stopped talking altogether, entranced by the performance. Even the barista behind the counter paused mid-pour to listen. The atmosphere in the room shifted completely. What had started as a lighthearted challenge had transformed into something profound. Karoline's playing wasn't flashy or showy. It was deeply moving, as if she were pouring her soul into every note. When she finally reached the end of the piece, there was a brief moment of silence before the room erupted into applause. Ethan sat frozen, unable to believe what he had just witnessed. His mind raced with questions. How could someone like Karoline, who seemed so focused on politics and strategy, possess such incredible musical talent? Why had she never mentioned it before? And most importantly, why had he assumed she wouldn't be able to play? For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt humbled. As Karoline stood up from the piano and returned to the table, he couldn't find the right words to express what he was feeling. All he could manage was a weak smile and a muttered, "Well, that was impressive." Karoline took her seat looking perfectly calm, as if nothing unusual had happened. "Thanks," she said with a small shrug. "I haven't played in a while, so I might be a little rusty." "A little rusty?" Ethan repeated incredulously. "That was amazing. Seriously, where did you learn to play like that?" Karoline hesitated for a moment, then glanced around the table. Everyone was staring at her now, eager to hear her answer. "It's a long story," she said finally. "Maybe I'll tell you, sometime." And with that, she picked up her coffee cup and took a sip, leaving Ethan and the rest of the group hanging on her every word. The coffee shop buzzed with energy after Karoline's unexpected performance. People who had been quietly sipping their drinks just moments ago were now whispering to each other, glancing at the piano, and then back at Karoline. Some even clapped, again, unable to contain their admiration. Ethan, however, remained silent, his mind racing as he tried to process what he'd just seen and heard. He couldn't stop thinking about how wrong he had been. He had challenged Karoline to play the piano not because he thought she could do it, but because he wanted to make a joke. He assumed she would either refuse or stumble through a few clumsy notes, proving his point that music wasn't for everyone. Instead, she had delivered a performance that left him speechless. It wasn't just good, it was extraordinary. Rest of the group slowly returned to their conversations, but Ethan couldn't shake off the feeling of awe mixed with guilt. He glanced at Karoline, who seemed completely unfazed by the attention. She was stirring her coffee absent-mindedly, as though playing Beethoven in front of strangers was something she did every day. Finally, unable to hold back any longer, Ethan leaned forward and said, "Okay, I need to know more. Where did you learn to play like that?" Karoline looked up from her cup and met his gaze. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then, with a small sigh, she began to explain. "I started taking lessons when I was 6, she said softly. "My parents thought it would be good for me to learn an instrument. They weren't musicians themselves, but they believed in the value of classical training." Ethan nodded, urging her to continue. "So you stuck with it?" he asked. "For a while, yes," Karoline replied. "I practiced every day, sometimes for hours. By the time I was in high school, I was pretty serious about it. I even considered studying music in college." "Then why didn't you?" Ethan interrupted, curiosity getting the better of him. Karoline hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "Things changed," she said finally. "Life got complicated. My family went through some tough times, and I had to focus on other priorities. Music became less important." Her voice trailed off, and Ethan noticed a hint of sadness in her expression. He realized there was more to her story, but he didn't press further. Instead, he said, "Still, you kept playing, right? You didn't just stop altogether." "No," Karoline admitted. "I never stopped completely. Even after I gave up performing, I would sit down at the piano whenever I needed to clear my head. It was always there for me like an old friend, but I haven't played in front of anyone in years, not until today. Ethan sat back in his chair, absorbing her words. He felt a pang of regret for mocking her earlier. He had judged her based on assumptions without knowing anything about her background or experiences. Now he couldn't help but admire her talent and her humility. Despite her skill, she didn't seem interested in showing off or seeking praise. She had simply accepted the challenge and done what came naturally to her. As the afternoon wore on, the conversation shifted to lighter topics. The group joked about random things, and Ethan found himself laughing along with everyone else. Yet his thoughts kept returning to Karoline. He couldn't shake the image of her sitting at the piano, her hands moving gracefully over the keys. There was something almost magical about the way she played, as if she were channeling emotions that words alone couldn't express. Later that evening, after saying goodbye to the group, Ethan walked home alone, replaying the day's events in his mind. He lived in a small apartment downtown, and the streets were quiet as he made his way back. The cool night air helped clear his head, but his thoughts were still consumed by Karoline. When he reached his building, he unlocked the door and stepped inside. His apartment was cozy, filled with books, sheet music, and instruments scattered around. A guitar leaned against the wall near the window, and a keyboard sat on a stand in the corner. Music was everywhere, reflecting his passion for the art form. But tonight, instead of picking up his guitar or sitting down at the keyboard, Ethan flopped onto the couch and stared at the ceiling. He thought about how easily he dismissed people who didn't share his interests. He prided himself on being open-minded, yet he had underestimated Karoline simply because she worked in politics, a field he often criticized. He had assumed she wouldn't understand or appreciate music, let alone excel at it, and yet here she was, someone who clearly had a deep connection to the art form, even if she chose not to pursue it professionally. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. He knew he owed Karoline an apology, not just for doubting her abilities, but for making light of something so meaningful to her. Music was personal, and he had treated it like a punchline. The realization weighed heavily on him. The next morning, Ethan woke up early, still thinking about Karoline. He decided to call her and invite her to lunch. It wasn't something he usually did, inviting someone he barely knew to spend time together. But he felt compelled to reach out. After all, she had shown him something remarkable, and he wanted to show her that he appreciated it. When he called, Karoline sounded surprised but agreed to meet him at a quiet diner nearby. Over burgers and fries, Ethan brought up the topic of her musical past again. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," he began, "about how life got in the way of your plans. I can't imagine how hard that must have been." Karoline shrugged, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of emotion. "It wasn't easy," she admitted, "but I don't regret the choices I made. Sometimes we have to put our dreams on hold for the sake of others, or ourselves. That doesn't mean we forget them entirely." Ethan nodded, understanding what she meant. "Do you ever wish you could go back to it? To music, I mean?" "I think about it sometimes," Karoline said thoughtfully. "But it's not realistic. I have a career now, responsibilities. Besides, I'm not sure I'd fit into that world anymore." "You never know," Ethan replied. "Music isn't something you leave behind. It stays with you, no matter where life takes you." They talked for hours, sharing stories and perspectives. Ethan learned more about Karoline's work in politics and her passion for creating change. In turn, he shared his own journey with music, how it had shaped him and given him purpose. By the end of the meal, they both felt a newfound respect for each other. As they parted ways, Ethan couldn't help but smile. He had gone into the day expecting nothing more than a casual chat, but he came away with something far greater, a deeper appreciation for someone he once misunderstood, and, perhaps just maybe, the beginning of a friendship that bridged their two very different worlds. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about Karoline. Days had passed since their lunch at the diner, but her story stayed with him. He found himself wondering what it must have been like for her to give up something she loved so deeply. Music was such a big part of his life that he couldn't imagine walking away from it. Yet Karoline had done just that, and she seemed at peace with her decision, even if there was a hint of longing in her voice when she spoke about it. One evening, as Ethan sat in his apartment strumming his guitar, an idea began to take shape in his mind. What if he could find a way to bring music back into Karoline's life, not as a career or obligation, but as something joyful and fulfilling? He knew she didn't need convincing. She already understood the power of music. But maybe, just maybe, they could create something together that combined their passions. The next day, Ethan called Karoline again. "Hey," he said when she answered. "I've been thinking about something and I wanted to run it by you." Karoline sounded curious. "Oh, what is it?" "Well," Ethan started, choosing his words carefully. "You know how passionate I am about music and how much you care about making a difference in the world. What if we worked on a project that brought those two things together? Something that uses music to highlight social issues or inspire change?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. Ethan held his breath, worried she might think the idea was too strange or impractical. Finally, Karoline spoke. "That's actually really interesting. I've never thought about combining music and activism before. What did you have in mind?" Relieved, Ethan explained his vision. "We could write pieces that tell stories about people facing challenges, fighting for justice, or finding hope in difficult times. You could help shape the messages and I'd handle the music side of things. It would be a collaboration, blending your expertise with mine." Karoline hesitated. "It sounds amazing, Ethan, but I'm not sure I'm the right person for this. I haven't composed anything in years and I don't want to disappoint you." "You won't," Ethan assured her quickly. "Knowledgeable strategist who understands the issues better than anyone else. And besides, this isn't about perfection. It's about creating something meaningful." After a moment of silence, Karoline sighed. "All right," she said finally. "Let's give it a try. But don't expect miracles." Ethan grinned. "Deal." They decided to meet at Ethan's studio the following weekend to brainstorm ideas. The space was small but inviting, filled with instruments, notebooks, and posters of famous musicians. A keyboard stood in one corner, surrounded by cables and microphones. Karoline looked around curiously as Ethan showed her where everything was. "So," Ethan said, sitting down at the keyboard, "where do we start?" Karoline pulled out a notebook and flipped it open. "Well, let's think about the kinds of issues we want to address. Education reform, healthcare access, climate change. The possibilities are endless. Once we pick a theme, we can build the music around it." Ethan nodded. "That makes sense. Why don't we start with education? It's something both of us care about and there are so many powerful stories to draw from." "Agreed," Karoline said, jotting down some notes. "Let's focus on students overcoming obstacles, things like poverty, discrimination, or lack of resources. Those are the stories that resonate most with people." For the next few hours, they bounced ideas off each other. Karoline shared anecdotes from her work in politics, while Ethan suggested musical styles that might fit the mood of each piece. They laughed, debated, and occasionally hit roadblocks, but overall the process felt exciting and productive. By the end of the session, they had outlined 3 potential compositions, each tied to a specific theme. Over the next several weeks, Ethan and Karoline met regularly to work on the project. Their partnership wasn't always smooth. There were moments of frustration and disagreement, but they learned to navigate their differences. Ethan tended to dive headfirst into creative experiments, while Karoline preferred careful planning and structure. At first, these contrasting approaches caused tension, but over time, they realized they balanced each other out. Ethan's spontaneity pushed Karoline out of her comfort zone while her discipline kept him grounded. As they worked, Ethan noticed subtle changes in Karoline. She seemed more confident, not just in her musical abilities but in herself. Sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, she would hum melodies or tap rhythms on the table. It was as if the project had awakened a part of her she had long buried. Ethan felt proud knowing he had played a role in that transformation. For Karoline, the experience was equally transformative. She had always seen music as a private escape, something she did alone to cope with stress or sadness. Collaborating with Ethan opened her eyes to its potential as a tool for connection and advocacy. Together, they crafted pieces that were both beautiful and impactful, weaving intricate harmonies with lyrics that spoke directly to the heart. One afternoon, as they fine-tuned a particularly emotional section of a song, Ethan turned to Karoline and said, "You know, I never would have come up with any of this without you. Your perspective has made all the difference." Karoline smiled, touched by his words. "And I never would have tried any of this without you pushing me. So I guess we're even." They laughed, the sound filling the studio like music itself. In that moment, Ethan realized how much he had grown to admire Karoline, not just for her talent but for her resilience, intelligence, and kindness. She had challenged his assumptions and broadened his horizons in ways he hadn't anticipated. As the project neared completion, Ethan and Karoline began discussing how to share their work with the world. They decided to debut their compositions at a community event focused on education reform. It was a perfect opportunity to reach an audience that cared deeply about the issues they were addressing. Both of them felt nervous but excited about the prospect of performing together. In the days leading up to the event, they rehearsed tirelessly, refining every note and lyric until it felt just right. Ethan encouraged Karoline to play the piano during one of the pieces, assuring her that the audience would love it. Though hesitant at first, she eventually agreed, realizing that stepping out of her comfort zone was part of the journey. On the morning of the performance, Ethan arrived at the venue early to set up. He adjusted the microphones, tested the sound system, and arranged the sheet music on the stand. When Karoline walked in carrying her notebook and a cup of coffee, he greeted her with a grin. "Ready to blow everyone away?" he asked. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, smiling nervously. Together they went over the program one last time, making sure everything was in place. As the room began to fill with people, Ethan glanced at Karoline and said, "No matter what happens tonight, I'm glad we did this. It's been an incredible experience." Karoline nodded, her expression softening. "Me too, Ethan. Me too." With that, they took their positions on stage, waiting for the lights to dim and the crowd to quiet. The moment had arrived, and neither of them knew exactly how it would unfold. But one thing was certain. They were ready to face it together. The community center was buzzing with energy. People filled the rows of chairs, chatting excitedly about the evening's program. Posters advertising the event lined the walls, featuring bold letters that read, "Music for Change, a night of art and advocacy." The room smelled of fresh paint and polished wood, and a single spotlight illuminated the stage where Ethan and Karoline stood quietly, preparing for their performance. Ethan adjusted his guitar strap one last time, his fingers brushing against the smooth strings. He glanced over at Karoline, who was seated at the piano, her hands resting gently on the keys. She looked calm, but he noticed the slight tremor in her fingers, a sign of nerves she couldn't completely hide. Ethan gave her a reassuring smile. "We've got this," he whispered. Karoline nodded, taking a deep breath to steady herself as the host introduced them. The chatter in the room faded and all eyes turned toward the stage. Ethan stepped up to the microphone, his voice warm and welcoming. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began. "What you're about to hear is more than just music. It's a story about struggle, hope, and resilience. These pieces were created to shine a light on issues that matter deeply to us, and we hope they inspire you to think, feel, and act." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "This project wouldn't have been possible without my collaborator, Karoline Leavitt. She brought not only her incredible talent, but also her passion for making the world a better place. So let's get started." With that, Ethan stepped back and the room fell silent. Karoline placed her hands on the piano keys, her posture straight and focused. The first notes rang out softly, gentle and haunting, like the first rays of dawn. breaking through darkness. It was the opening piece they had titled Voices Unheard, a tribute to students facing adversity in underfunded schools. As Karoline played, Ethan joined in with his guitar, adding depth and texture to the melody. The combination of the piano's rich tones and the guitar's warm resonance created a sound that was both intimate and powerful. The audience listened intently, some closing their eyes to fully absorb the music. When Ethan began to sing, his voice carried the weight of the lyrics, each word carefully chosen to convey the struggles and dreams of those fighting for a brighter future. Through broken windows, through empty halls, their voices rise, though no one hears their calls. But still they dream, with hearts so strong that one day soon the world will sing their song. By the time the final note faded, there was a moment of stunned silence. Then applause erupted, filling the room with warmth and admiration. Ethan bowed slightly while Karoline offered a small, grateful smile. Neither of them expected such an immediate reaction, but it fueled their confidence as they moved on to the next piece. The second composition was different in tone but equally moving. Titled Ripples of Hope, it focused on teachers working tirelessly to make a difference despite limited resources. This time, Ethan took the lead on vocals, his guitar providing a steady rhythm. Karoline accompanied him on the piano, her playing, delicate yet deliberate, mimicking the quiet determination of educators everywhere. The lyrics told the story of a teacher staying late to grade papers, sacrificing weekends to prepare lessons, and finding joy in even the smallest victories. The music swelled during the chorus, capturing the emotional highs and lows of a profession often overlooked. As they played, Ethan noticed several people in the audience nodding along, tears glistening in their eyes. He realized that the message was resonating, not just intellectually but emotionally. When the song ended, the applause was even louder than before. Someone shouted, "Beautiful," from the back of the room, prompting laughter and cheers from others. Ethan grinned, feeling a sense of accomplishment wash over him. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to use music not just as self-expression, but as a tool for connection and change. For the final piece, Ethan and Karoline decided to perform something unexpected. Instead of sticking to their planned program, they chose to improvise a short duet, a conversation between the piano and the guitar. It was a risky move, but they trusted each other enough to take the leap. Karoline started with a simple melody, her fingers gliding effortlessly across the keys. Ethan responded with soft strums, weaving his notes around hers. Together, they built a dialogue, alternating between playful exchanges and moments of quiet harmony. There were no lyrics this time, just pure, unspoken emotion. The improvisation felt raw and authentic, as if the instruments themselves were speaking directly to the audience. When they finished, the room erupted into thunderous applause. People stood up, clapping and cheering, unwilling to let the moment end. Ethan and Karoline exchanged a look, their faces glowing with pride and relief. They had done it. They had shared their message, and it had touched people in ways they hadn't imagined. After the performance, attendees gathered around the stage to congratulate Ethan and Karoline. Some praised their technical skill, while others thanked them for addressing important issues through art. One woman approached Karoline with tears in her eyes. "That first piece, it reminded me of my own childhood," she said. "I went to a school like the ones you described, and hearing your music made me feel seen." "Thank you." Karoline was speechless for a moment, overwhelmed by the sincerity of the comment. "Thank you for sharing that with me," she replied softly. "That's exactly why we did this, to remind people they're not alone." Meanwhile, Ethan chatted with a group of young musicians who had attended the event. "How do you write songs that mean so much?" one of them asked. Ethan chuckled, scratching the back of his neck. "Honestly, it's not just me. Music becomes meaningful when it's connected to real experiences and emotions. Find something you care about, and let that guide you." As the night wound down, Ethan and Karoline finally had a chance to sit together and reflect on what had happened. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving them exhausted but exhilarated. Can you believe that just happened? Ethan asked, leaning back in his chair. I'm still trying to process it, Karoline admitted, shaking her head in disbelief. I didn't expect people to react the way they did. They reacted because you poured your heart into it, Ethan said, firmly. You can't fake that kind of authenticity. It's what makes art powerful. Karoline smiled, her cheeks flushing slightly at the compliment. Well, I couldn't have done it without you. You pushed me to try things I never thought I'd do again. And you kept me grounded when I wanted to go off the rails, Ethan countered with a laugh. We make a pretty good team, don't we? We do, Karoline agreed. Who would have thought? They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the last few guests trickled out of the venue. The cleanup crew began packing away chairs and dismantling equipment, signaling the official end of the night. Despite the fatigue settling into their bones, neither of them wanted to leave just yet. The evening had been magical, and they knew it was a memory they would carry with them forever. Finally, Ethan stood up and stretched. Ready to call it a night? He asked. Karoline nodded, rising to her feet. Yeah, let's go home and rest. Tomorrow, we can start thinking about what's next. What's next? Ethan echoed, raising an eyebrow. You mean there's more? Of course there's more, Karoline said with a mischievous grin. We've only scratched the surface. Ethan laughed, feeling a spark of excitement ignite within him. Whatever came next, he knew it would be worth it as long as they faced it together. The days following the performance were a whirlwind for Ethan and Karoline. News of their collaboration spread quickly, thanks to social media posts and word of mouth from attendees who couldn't stop talking about the emotional impact of the music. Local newspapers wrote articles praising the event, calling it a groundbreaking fusion of art and activism. Even people who hadn't been there reached out to congratulate them, eager to learn more about their work. Ethan was thrilled by the response, but also a little overwhelmed. He wasn't used to this level of attention. His previous performances had been small gigs at coffee shops or open mic nights, nothing like the packed community center they'd played in last week. For once, he didn't feel the need to boast or crack jokes. Instead, he found himself humbled by how deeply their message had resonated with others. Karoline, on the other hand, handled the spotlight with quiet grace. She answered emails from curious listeners and politely declined interview requests, explaining that she preferred to let the music speak for itself. Still, she couldn't deny the sense of fulfillment she felt knowing her contribution had made a difference. It was strange yet satisfying to see something so personal become so public. One afternoon, as they met at Ethan's studio to discuss what came next, Karoline brought up an idea. What if we turned this into something bigger? She suggested. Not just one-off performances, but a series of events or even an album. Ethan's eyes lit up. An album? That's ambitious, but I love it. We could release it online and donate part of the proceeds to organizations working on these issues. It would keep the momentum going. They spent hours brainstorming, sketching, out plans for new compositions and potential venues. Each idea sparked another, their creativity feeding off each other's enthusiasm. By the end of the session, they had a rough outline for a full-length project that would explore themes like inequality, resilience, and hope. As weeks turned into months, Ethan and Karoline threw themselves into the process. They worked tirelessly, balancing their day jobs with late-night rehearsals and recording sessions. The studio became their second home, filled with scribbled notes, half-empty coffee cups, and the occasional burst of laughter when things didn't go as planned. Their partnership deepened during this time. They learned to navigate each other's quirks and preferences, finding a rhythm that allowed them to collaborate seamlessly. Ethan admired Karoline's discipline and focus, while Karoline appreciated Ethan's spontaneity and passion. Together, they created something neither of them could have accomplished alone. One evening, after finishing a particularly challenging track, Ethan leaned back in his chair and sighed. You know, he said, glancing at Karoline, I never thought I'd say this, but I'm really glad you accepted my challenge that day at the coffee shop. If you hadn't played that piano, none of this would have happened. Karoline smiled, her expression softening. Me too. I wasn't sure about stepping back into music, but now I can't imagine walking away again. It feels right. It does, Ethan agreed. And not just because of the music. This whole experience has changed how I think about people. About assumptions and stereotypes. You've taught me a lot, Karoline. She raised an eyebrow, amused. Oh? Like what? Like how wrong I can be, Ethan admitted with a chuckle. I judged you based on your job and assumed you wouldn't understand music the way I do. But you proved me wrong. In the best possible way. Karoline laughed softly. Well, maybe we've both learned something from each other. You've reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place. And honestly, I don't think I could have done any of this without your encouragement. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their journey settling between them. It wasn't just about the music anymore. It was about the connection they had built through shared effort and mutual respect. When the album was finally ready, they decided to host a launch event at the same community center where they'd performed before. The room was decorated with string lights and posters showcasing the album cover, a striking image of intertwined musical notes and protest signs. Friends, family, and supporters gathered to celebrate the culmination of months of hard work. Ethan and Karoline took turns speaking to the crowd, expressing gratitude for everyone who had supported them along the way. This project is proof that art and activism can go hand in hand, Karoline said, her voice steady and sincere. We hope it inspires you to use your own talents to make a difference. When it was time to perform, they opened with Voices Unheard, the piece that had started it all. As the familiar notes filled the room, Ethan glanced at Karoline and saw the same determination and joy he'd witnessed countless times before. By the end of the night, the audience was on their feet, cheering wildly. Afterward, as they stood, side by side signing copies of the album, Ethan turned to Karoline with a grin. So, he said, what's next, another album? A world tour? Karoline laughed, shaking her head. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, but seriously, I think we've only begun to scratch the surface. There are so many stories left to tell. Ethan nodded, feeling a surge of excitement. Then let's keep telling them, together. In the months that followed, Ethan and Karoline continued to build on their success. They performed at schools, community centers, and conferences, using their platform to amplify voices often ignored. Their music became a bridge between worlds, bringing people together across divides of politics, culture, and experience. Through it all, their friendship grew stronger. They weren't just collaborators anymore, they were partners in every sense of the word. While their backgrounds and interests remained different, they discovered that those differences made their bond richer and more meaningful. Looking back, neither of them could have predicted how far they'd come since that fateful day at the coffee shop. What started as a playful dare had transformed into something extraordinary, a testament to the power of creativity, courage, and human connection. And as they stood on stage together, bathed in applause and gratitude, they knew they were exactly where they were meant to be.